get started now. We have a lot of people who have purchased or registered for this seminar, but chances are they're in the middle of something and can't join right now. So we're going to just continue on here. So my name is Nicole Olivier. I'm Programs Manager with the Canadian Mountain Network. And today we're bringing you a webinar for the SMARTS program on podcasting for building understanding and mobilizing knowledge. And this webinar will be led by the team for the Canadian Mountain podcast.
So good morning, everyone. I just wanted to start off by saying thank you for joining us today in this virtual space with the SMARTS webinar. I'm Gabrielle Pisca, one of the hosts and producers with the Canadian Mountain podcast. Today, we will present a podcast that highlights research done in and around Canada's mountain ranges, as well as focuses on bringing together both Indigenous knowledge and settler perspective. We will also talk about how the show incorporates knowledge mobilization. Specifically, this podcast looks at scientific and sometimes hard to understand research and mobilizes it into a format more accessible and comprehensive to the general public. We will also touch on our experiences with building a land acknowledgement for the show. Now, before we dive into it, I wanted to take a moment to introduce the podcast itself. So what is the Canadian Mountain Podcast? Well, the Canadian Mountain Podcast, or CMP, is a podcast series that works as an extension of the Canadian Mountain Network. The Canadian Mountain Network is Canada's first formal research organization that focuses on understanding more about mountain systems specifically. The CMP production is a collaborative project between the Canadian Mountain Network and Mount Royal University here in Calgary, Alberta. The head producers and coordinators of this podcast are Meg Wilcox and Kyle Napier, with senior students, producers, and hosts, including myself, Eric Tanner, and Ethan Ward. This year, however, we've also expanded our team with Vanessa Forbister, Catalina Berguno, and Sydney Klassen-Rosewarn as new producers and hosts for the show. While the main theme of the podcast is to focus our episodes around mountain systems, we also aim to take what may be difficult scientific content and deliver it in a format that is more digestible for a general audience. We also aim to learn about different types of knowledge systems, specifically Indigenous ways of knowing, and create a space where we can learn about mountains in different ways. I'm now going to pass it off to Kata, who will speak on why we do what we do and why that's so important.
Hi, so as Gabby briefly touched on earlier, the Canadian Mountain Podcast focuses mainly on mountain systems and incorporating Indigenous-led research. So as some of you may know, the mountains make up a huge part of our landmass, with roughly about 25%. So there is plenty of information and research that involves the mountains, but making sure this information reaches a broader audience is also important. The Canadian Mountain in particular supports research that is centered around a holistic approach. And so it can foster relationships and show people that incorporating Indigenous-led research is important and relevant to assisting communities. One problem when it comes to academic research is accessibility. And not everyone has access to academic articles, and the Canadian Mountain Podcast is a good way of countering that by the way we translate research. Also, our podcast gives the opportunity to bring forth ideas and a conversation that are normally left in the dark, and give voices to people whose voices are not normally heard. Bringing this type of knowledge mobilization to people's ears can help more people care about the issues that are discussed in the podcast, like climate change and treatment towards Indigenous peoples. When you have a landscape that influences such a big part of a water supply, natural resources, and energy, it stands to reason why these topics would benefit the general public. So I will now pass it on to Ethan.
Hello, thank you, Kata. My name is Ethan Ward, and I'm going to go over what the general process looks like for creating an entire episode for this show. So our podcast has adapted over the past few seasons, evolving in ways that us as journalism and history students wouldn't have anticipated. One huge shakeup was the change in how we handled questions. We now send questions to our guests ahead of an interview, which is generally considered bad journalistic practice. As a journalism student, in our first year in the journalism program at Mount Royal, students are taught that sending questions to your source ahead of time is a big no-no, so to speak. The fear is that a journalist won't get a genuine response from a source. Rather, it would be a rehearsed and boilerplate answer. However, with the Canadian Mountain podcast, the goal is to create a safe space for our guests to share their stories and research. We found that sharing the questions beforehand created an environment where our guests felt more prepared and comfortable coming into the interview. We decided that this was more important than following those standard journalistic practices. So that mindset feeds into our creative and professional process and helps lay the groundwork for the steps that go into crafting an episode, which I will be highlighting next. So the process we go through in creating our episodes is designed in a way to keep episodes rolling while also taking the time to do proper research. We have a detailed production document that goes over a long list of steps in detail to make sure our goals, which have been stated, are met. I could go into a very detailed description of that, but I will condense it into four larger, the most important steps. So step one is to research our episode topic, as well as any guests who can speak on this topic in a range of ways. We usually decide on the topics and have an idea of guests for all of our episodes at the beginning of a new season, where we receive some topic ideas from the network and some from our own brainstorming. Once we get the go-ahead on the topics and people, we each split off into pairs of 2 per episode, spanning several months, ideally with 1 episode released per month. One of us is the host and the other is a producer, and that's our team of 2 for each episode. We then begin more extensive research on our designated topics and learning more about each guest. The second part is then proceeding to write out the questions we'll ask our guests. After they've been approved by the network, we contact our guests to arrange time for a pre-interview. During the pre-interview, we go over any concerns or comments that our sources have about the podcasting and interviewing process, as well as any suggestions they have for the questions we created. So this is super vital to our production philosophy, as this is where we can help make the guest as comfortable as possible as we move into the proper interview itself. So we want to make sure that they'll be aware of the process beforehand and that they'll work alongside us in crafting the path the episode will take. It is all about that cooperative, collaborative approach. So we also use this time during the pre-interview to book the actual interview, sometimes booking several months in advance in order to allow for everyone on the episode to be present at one time. This can be especially difficult with people working in vastly different time zones and living all around the world. As an example, the last episode that I worked on had people calling in from the other side of the world, from Switzerland, from Nepal, basically at the complete opposite time of day that we were at. We also take this time to make sure our audio software is running and good to go before the main meeting with our guests. So step 3 is the big day of the interview. We always make sure to do an audio and sound check before and after the recording to make sure everything was recorded correctly and saved to our computers. That's, of course, is the journalist's worst nightmare, is getting done with an interview or a long recording session and realizing that there was some audio malfunction or technicality that happened that made you lose all of your material. So this interview is where all of our research and preparation pays off. The guests have full knowledge of what is being asked. They are better prepared and have the opportunity to better share their knowledge with us and the community who is going to be listening to the episode. Our final and 4th main step of the process is several rounds of editing. First, we write the script, and then we edit it according to feedback from Meg and Kyle, and then we go ahead with a first draft of the episode. After a meeting to discuss edits and changes, we incorporate those into a second and final draft of our episode. This final draft is always sent to our guests before release, so they can provide some input on the episode and if they have concerns with the way they sound or were represented. Again, this ties into the collaborative approach we try and foster. And then finally, we upload the episode to a software called Simplecast, write out any descriptions or information about the episode, and let the Canadian Mountain Network publish the episode on the day of their choosing. So this long process that I just described is back and forth and usually takes about a month. However, we understand that our guests can get very busy, and so we usually try and start our research and book our guests a few months in advance to try or to allow for responses or for a time response for any booking delays. So while this summary only covers the generalities of podcast production, it is a system that bridges the gap between standard journalism and a more considered source-focused approach. It is something the team has become accustomed to, and we hope that other podcasting or media groups learn from our process or even better improve upon it. So now that I've gone over that process, I will pass it over to Vanessa, who will talk about how our approach has created some of the general themes of practice that the Canadian Mountain Podcast uses as guiding principles, and that we hope more media organizations begin to adopt. So yeah, I'll pass it over to Vanessa now.
Perfect. Thanks for doing that intro to our section, Ethan. So the creation of a podcast episode is a very open and collaborative process. Each podcast member works with each other to construct the best questions and experience for the episode. Each episode, we had 2 students producing and hosting an episode, which was really great, balancing the work and making it so it helped each other bounce ideas off each other. Journalists need to be able to change and create new standards of practice, as Ethan mentioned. Through trial and error, we discovered people were at their best when given the questions in advance. Guests felt more relaxed and prepared when the questions were shared with them. Sharing the questions with the guests also made the interview go more smoothly. There was less uncomfortable pausing and more time for them to reflect and answer the questions with confidence. Through this process, we had to create a podcast that feels and sounds genuine. It also helped guests to see our standard in terms of wanting to be transparent and to keep an open dialogue with them. Creating a relationship where everyone feels respected and comfortable to share their ideas was fundamental for our group. We try to maintain this open dialogue not only prior to the interview, but during the interview process as well, including a space for our guests to speak on their home and the land they reside on. We allow our guests to introduce themselves and their work. This provides a foundation for the episode and creates space for our guests to make themselves comfortable and provide a summary for their work in a way that felt most appropriate for them. A core base for this podcast was creating a sense of home. Home was where people feel the most at ease and relaxed. We wanted this sentiment to translate into our interviews and discussions. The ability to capture inclusivity and interest was a common theme and goal we had as a group. I will now pass it over to Eric.
Okay, thank you very much, Vanessa. So while podcasting itself is an incredible tool to bring unheard voices and research to the ears of the public, there are a few challenges that we found necessary to sort of pin down before you get your fledgling ideas and anecdotes ready to be broadcast for the world to hear. Perhaps the biggest challenge we found with producing the podcast is making sure that our audience knows what's being discussed so they can actually digest the new information being handed their way. This goes simply beyond having your guests having proper audio gear such as mics and headphones, having good editing software and knowing how to use it yourself, and just having a fine quality production quality for your series. While these are all undoubtedly necessary, it's essential to create both a script and question line that are consumable and consistent for both you and your audience. Especially when discussing a guest's research, it can be easy for that source to get lost in their own achievements and findings, leaving both yourself and the listener confused in the episode's narrative as it kind of veers off course. Not every podcast listener, especially ones who aren't adept in the topic being covered, are going to be fluent with specific abbreviations or pieces of jargon that a source may bring up. So don't feel hesitant to go over your own questions with, say, a coworker, a family member beforehand, or while the interview process is going on. Don't be afraid to dumb down a question, so to say, so that the language can be used for a general audience. As mentioned previously, sending an episode question line and outline to guests beforehand can really help find crucial oversights that you may have missed, while also helping your sources and yourself feel more comfortable in what can be an intimidating space. This also helps in creating the home that Vanessa mentioned earlier. However, despite all the planning that you may put in beforehand, we've had a few instances where guests have turned out to be a little more nervous about the interview than we'd wished, or even gotten cold feet at the last minute and have had to be replaced. Despite all the planning that you may put in advance, anything can happen at the last minute. And while research is important, you definitely have to be flexible. Additionally, it's also been important for us to keep a general flow for future episodes of the series. Returning listeners have come back due to a positive impression that you've left. And yeah, as much as we've wanted to implement a few changes mid-season, we also don't really want to throw our listeners for a loop. Consistency is essential, and this may mean prefacing a status quo break before an episode begins, or leaving larger changes to formatting or your script, say, between seasons. This is despite how tempting a one-off alteration may appear. An additional difficulty is working remotely with guests who may not be fully adept with the technology or software we've utilized over the production of the podcast. It's created a double-edged sword, so to say, as well. We've had the opportunities to interview guests from across the globe, as Ethan mentioned earlier, and give listeners some incredible insights and anecdotes. We've had just as many technical difficulties along with these wonderful moments. As we all know, Zoom, working on software such as Squadcast, it's been difficult for those who do not know it. Difficult time zones, varying internet strength, and poor mics have also been a couple of persistent troubles. And finally, maybe the biggest lifesaver that we've learned while working on the podcast is sort of creating a step-by-step guide to any software you plan to use, so you can have it ready for you and your guests. If you've had to learn the ins and outs yourself, then it's likely your guests will too. But despite these challenges, there are a myriad of opportunities associated with podcasting. And I'll pass it over to Sid, who will discuss the opportunities that come along with the creation of a podcast.
Thanks, Eric. As Eric pointed out, being part of the CMP team comes with its challenges, but it's also given all of us many opportunities to learn from the knowledge holders we interview and strengthen our abilities as communicators, podcasters, and journalists. Being part of this team gives us all the opportunity to participate in various aspects of podcast production. Although we learn audio production and storytelling in our journalism classes, those skills don't get better if we aren't able to practice them. And on this team, we have the opportunity to work on these skills with the support and supervision of Meg and Kyle. But in the CMP setting, it's even more unique because we focus heavily on research and research translation. As communicators, it's really important that we are able to not only understand research and academic writing, but be able to translate it as well into a format that people who either aren't researchers can understand. This means helping our guests share their knowledge in a way that can be understood by people from outside their area of expertise and knowledge system. And the biggest part of knowledge mobilization is collaboration. In our position as podcast communicators, we aren't creating content so much as we are the catalyst between knowledge holders and the audience. Lastly, all of us really love the mountains and spending time in nature, and that's why we chose to work on this team. And living in Calgary, we are privileged to have access to those spaces we all value. I know it's a huge privilege to be able to work in an area of interest that matters to me, which is why it's so cool to be a part of this team. All the opportunities for skill development we get is made better by the fact that we get to do this all with and about people and places we care about. Being part of this team means the opportunity to participate in podcasting for knowledge mobilization about the mountains we care about. And I'll hand it back over to Eric, who's going to tell us a bit about what knowledge mobilization is, as well as who it involves.
Okay, thank you, Sid. So the Canadian Mountain Podcast is equally a job as it is a passion project for all of us. We here have made it our main goal to highlight the collaborations of organizations and researchers, those who, as mentioned before, are employing both Indigenous and settler methods to further their examinations through knowledge mobilization. For those unfamiliar, knowledge mobilization is the production, dissemination, and exchange of research to a new audience. In this case, the new audience would be our listeners. All of us hosts and producers have a personal connection and love for the rocky ridges and landscapes that we call home here. Despite this, many of us have been unaware or taken aback by some of the findings our interviewees have talked about. This is exactly kind of what we wanted to foster when we were producing the podcast, bringing together the innovations and findings within the Canadian Mountain Network's numerous researchers, knowledge hubs, and systems in a method that can be both articulate and audience friendly. This podcast, Knowledge Mobilization, provides a conversational platform to facilitate the sharing of information through more than just simple word of mouth. We do this mainly for an audience who may be unaware otherwise, sort of like we were, of the findings in both casual and professional areas that they may be interested in. Through this effort, many of these knowledge hubs, scientific studies through the Canadian Mountain Network, and findings are spreading along more than those who are already in the know, so to speak. And so next we'll have Nicole Olivier come back on to discuss the new audiences the podcast has allowed the network to reach.
Nicole, you're muted.
And Zoom, here we go again. So thanks, Eric. As Eric was mentioning, we need to reach broad audiences. We need to reach people across the world and through different routes. And the podcast has really allowed us to do that. Canadian Mountain Network reaches people all over the world in 151 countries through all of our communications products, through social media, the internet, our website, our newsletter. But the podcast allows us to reach an additional 21 countries not reached through our standard products, and an additional over 7,200 unique listeners. So this is really key, in terms of learning who your audience is and the demographic and what they're using to access information, and creating something that they're going to return to, listen to again and again. So this has been a real learning experience for us in adding audio podcasting and storytelling to the suite of resources we have to reach people. And appreciate the podcast team being able to do that for us. And I'm going to pass it now over to Vanessa.
Perfect. Thanks, Nicole. Sorry, my notes are a little jumbled here. Here we go. Perspective is everything. It can help mold our opinions and enrich our lives with knowledge that wasn't obvious to us. This is why land acknowledgement was so critical to our podcast and making sure we did the best we could to present it correctly. The research conducted for the land acknowledgement has shown us how powerful connection between Indigenous peoples and land are. We wanted to make sure Indigenous voices were genuinely represented. The best way to do this is to have a conversation with Indigenous peoples. Even during the editing process for this presentation, we were constantly learning and correcting ourselves. There's always something to learn with our approach to Indigenous perspectives. That's the core value of this land acknowledgement. We all were humble and graciously reminded to do better and be better, to set an example. Research perspective also gave us skills we can use outside of the podcast, how we approach speaking with people and being aware that inclusivity doesn't stop when the episode is finished recording. It's encouraging people to do research on their own time and be mindful of where they are and what we can do for reconciliation. The ability to actively listen and understand where someone is coming from is a fundamental aspect to journalism. Actions do speak louder than words, and showing inclusivity can help encourage solidarity between settlers and Indigenous peoples. Journalism is having the ability to adapt to create new standards and practices for future journalists. Words such as reconciliation and solidarity should be the prime focus when learning and conducting a land acknowledgement. These words gave us perspective to our research, and we wanted it to be heard and felt in our podcast. I'm going to pass off the next slide to Gabby, Ethan, and Eric, who will discuss their article on land acknowledgements and podcasting, now published in JSOURCE.
Thanks, Vanessa. So when we first started creating our land acknowledgement for the show, I think I can speak for all three of us when I say that I felt apprehensive. While the production of a land acknowledgement was important, I felt nervous to mess up or say the wrong things. But after many conversations around proper acknowledgement to the land, as well as hours of learning and listening, we completed our land acknowledgement in the opening of our third season. Once the acknowledgement had been completed, we decided we wanted to write an article about our experiences, hoping it would help other podcasters feel better about writing their own land acknowledgement. We can see a clip of this article on the next slide. So we first pitched the article to JSource, a national publication led by the Toronto Metropolitan University, or previously known as Ryerson University, and Carleton University. The publication works in collaboration with post-secondary journalism programs across the country to publish news and articles around journalism education. When we decided to pitch the article about our process in creating a land acknowledgement, I felt nervous. While I was interested in the article on the topic itself, the idea of actually being the one writing it made me feel anxious. I was worried that what was being read would come off differently than I had meant it, creating more harm and confusion than good. But in the end, that uncertainty and admittance to fault was what made the article come to life for me. The article touches on the history of land acknowledgements and the lack thereof in a media setting. Yet for me, the heart of the article actually came from the vulnerability of our writing and the transparency of our process to creating the acknowledgement. In the end, I feel that the article is something that stands not only as a tool for future podcasters, but also as a solidified work on our knowledge within both the acknowledgement process and writing the article itself. Starting this process, I knew very little about the importance of land acknowledgements. I also didn't really ever take the time to appreciate the things that this land gives me. So the process really allowed me to not only understand the reasoning and the need for more media attention and inclusion to things such as land acknowledgements, but to also really think about more critically and fully about the different types of knowledge that we could learn from these same systems. Now I'll pass it off to Ethan there to talk about his experience on the article as well.
Yep, thank you, Gabby. I'll pick up where she left off. Here are kind of my own thoughts and feelings on the process that we went through on writing this JSource article. So out of the three of us, I certainly didn't do as much work on the article as Eric or Gabby did. Nevertheless, as Gabby expressed earlier, I definitely felt some trepidation moving forward with it. While writing, all three of us expressed the worry of not properly recognizing the importance of land acknowledgements, or that we were offending in some way. This feeling was also present in the content of the article itself. We were wanting to get our feelings across while also highlighting how land acknowledgements are missing from most media. It was a fine line to balance between personal struggles with the topic and our work being a research-focused article. With all of our extensive work on the topic, I'm not sure it's something I've ever been, or even with all of our extensive work on the topic, I'm not sure it's ever something I've ever been fully comfortable with. But we did receive lots of support during the writing process. A Cree colleague with the project, Sarah Buffalo, who worked on the podcast with us for several months in 2021, encouraged us to think of our own homes and what the land means to us when working on the land acknowledgement. It was the most vital aspect I always fell back on when I was doubting or questioning myself about whether I was performing land acknowledgements or land acknowledgement work correctly. What I do in my spare time, like taking trips to the mountains, that's how I come to appreciate the land. And coming from a place of sincerity is what made our work meaningful. So that ties into the article process that I mentioned earlier. It was balancing out feelings on the matter with well thought out research. I think the hope was to show our own experiences with land acknowledgements and encourage other podcasters or media personalities and organizations to follow in our footsteps, or better yet, improve on the formula we worked on. That's what the article was all about. And I'm going to let Eric finish this section off.
All right, thanks, Ethan. So recalling our first experience in land acknowledgements, our biggest fear was just creating a sentiment in which our expression of gratitude came off as insincere or lifeless. However, by adopting a similar approach to how we wrote our land acknowledgements itself, that eased the worry rather quickly. We took a few days to iron out any oversights, bounce ideas, and work on some improvements in proofing sessions by creating an environment that was really present when creating the podcast itself. This was time, it just resided in a more print facade with our article. This also assisted when including topics such as having our guests introduce themselves in their home, letting some personality seep through into the piece alongside our catalog of previously released episodes, hopefully showed the readers our own vulnerabilities and objectives when creating this, and showing that anyone can really do the same. As Ethan mentioned previously, I believe if our article can push anyone to move past the lingering hesitancies to create their own acknowledgement, then this will have been a resounding success. And the same goes for anyone, whether it be in a podcast setting or not, to have any unaware individual or aspiring producer look simply beyond placing a pre-made acknowledgement in and give true appreciation for the land is our end goal. And so now I'll pass it off to Vanessa and Gabby as we begin to conclude.
Perfect. Thank you, Eric. As students and future graduates, it is our responsibility to set new standards for journalism. A part of our journey is to continue approaching our land acknowledgement with respect and an open mind. Creating a space where all types of knowledge holders can feel included and represented is the intention of this land acknowledgement and our podcast. Journalism and storytelling is a major responsibility. Inclusivity can only increase the quality of storytelling. This podcast has taught us to engage with our community and facilitate change and growth in this industry.
Overall, the Canadian Mountain Podcast is a project that not only focuses on the audio production aspects of journalism, but it also allows us as students an opportunity to learn so many different types of knowledge systems, while being able to mobilize that knowledge for others to listen and learn. The podcast, in our eyes, plays an important role in that it focuses on different ways of knowledge mobilization, many of which the media or podcast community has not really done before. The importance of this podcast is not only the content of the episodes, but to begin to normalize other media practices, such as research and production of our own land acknowledgement, to foster episodes that include both settler and Indigenous ways of knowing, and to create a safe space for our guests to talk and share their stories in a way that is personal and genuine. And finally, we would like to thank both the Canadian Mountain Network as well as Mount Royal University for their collaboration with the Canadian Mountain Podcast, allowing us a platform to create genuine and meaningful content. This wouldn't be possible without the funding for the Government of Canada's Networks of Centres of Excellence. We'll now have time for any questions from the audience or any comments at all. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Just want to take a moment to acknowledge that the Canadian Mountain Network and the Canadian Mountain Podcast are funded through the generous funding program of the Government of Canada, the Networks of Centres of Excellence. And so without that, this wouldn't be possible. We do have one question so far that has come through, and that is, what avenues do you use to increase listenership, such as marketing tactics, etc.? And what happens at the end of the podcast, when the team has completed the production, they send that episode over to our communications team. And in the platform called Simplecast, we press publish and that gets released. And so there's a few things that take place. It gets released to all the podcasting platforms and where listeners are perusing or they're either subscribing. And then the Canadian Podcast or the Canadian Mountain Network's communications team has a launch plan and a communications plan for how we put out all of our communications. And so for this, we do a blog post that gets put up our network on our network's website. We do a newsletter where we share that out there. We do social media posts on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And then we do rely a lot on the social media platform sharing to move our message around as well. And so we have yet to put any sort of sponsored advertising towards it. Simply just been that natural that natural growth through the communications that we've been able to do make the reach that we've made so far. That helps. And then of course, along with that, I mean, I guess marketing tactics would also be, looking at who's been part of that episode, the topics, hashtagging and researching hashtags to make sure that we've tagged an episode properly and those sorts of things. Not too sure if anyone has anything more that we want to add to how we've gone about sharing that or promoting those things. Is there anyone else from the podcast team today who has maybe they touched on something but you wanted to expand on a bit more, or we've got a bit of extra time here, so maybe if there was something that we had a really big list of things we could talk about and share, but maybe there's something else that we want to add into the discussion today. I'll turn to the team to put everybody.
There's some questions in the chat here. So the first question I see is how many hours of work for one podcast? I think that kind of depends on where the episode is going. So we have interviews that are about a half hour long, or interviews that are an hour and a half. And so I think that really depends. So if the interview is longer, there's more time, you need more time to edit, or if we have a fluctuating amount of guests, then changing the questions or being in that way. I'm trying to think of an average. We kind of rotate in terms of episodes. So we'll be working on an episode or two, and then we won't be working on an episode for a month or two. And so we kind of rotate between working on it and not working on it. But when working on it, I would say about 5 to 8 hours a week, depending on what stage we're at, and depending on what role you have. If anyone else would like to chime into that too.
I was just going to jump in, Gabby, and say that, probably on the planning, you're probably looking at about 5 hours or less. Then there's the interview itself, which will probably be, let's say, about an hour and a half. The editing and revisions, I'd be curious to know how long it takes you normally to edit an episode.
Yeah, so for revising an episode, going through, taking any potential feedback, or doing a few edits that you may have missed over in a first draft or something, I'd say going through your draft of an episode twice, well, you'll probably be around, say, 3 hours worth of editing for around an hour-long episode going through it twice, just having that extra half an hour each time to go through, maybe fix up a little bit the audio, clean it up, put in the music, any type of external things you need to add in that regard. I wouldn't say the editing process is as daunting as it may seem cut out to be. A lot of it is more just in research and ensuring that you make it easier for yourself later on while you're editing.
And I would add, if you haven't done any editing before, you'll find that the first episode or two is going to take quite a bit of time, and you can almost cut your editing time in half the first couple of times as you're getting comfortable with the equipment. But I'm thinking, thank you for that, Eric. So I'm thinking it's probably fair to say about 15 hours, maybe between 10 and 15 hours to put together these episodes.
I have one question on what would you say is the most important part of starting a podcast?
I could speak on that quickly. So for me personally, the most important part of starting a podcast, I mean, don't get me wrong, the things such as getting the right audio and having the right questions, things like that are important. But for me, it's really driving into that focus. So making sure that you have a really clear focus of what you want for your episodes and what you want for the theme. And then whatever kind of focus that is, make sure you're doing it, I would say, for the right reasons, and make sure you're doing it in a way that's authentic and genuine, depending on the topic. There's a lot about mountain research that I didn't know, I didn't understand. And same with, like I mentioned, with building a land acknowledgement. And I think admitting the things I didn't know and being willing to learn and willing to engage was the most important part of this podcast for me.
So what are some helpful tips when you're creating questions for knowledge holders, researchers who are really knowledgeable on a topic, but maybe you're going through the process of getting them to bring you that detail, but then you want to bring it into a language and level of language for everybody to digest and understand. And do you have any tips on how you go about working with your sources and creating those questions?
I think I have something like a little bit to speak on that. I think it's don't be afraid to ask like general questions, like if you're doing like for example doing a project upcoming episode on project like a mountain management, and one of our first questions we ask, can you please explain what is this project about mountain management about, and what is it like targeted towards? Like, it's don't be afraid to ask questions that even though in your head might seem dumb, because if you don't know what you're talking about, then if you don't know like what it's about, then you're probably gonna have a hard time trying to explain to other people what it's about. So I think don't be afraid of just asking questions. They will be more than happy to answer them for you, even if they may sound dumb to you. Is probably what other people will be thinking when listening to this. So just don't be afraid to do that, I would say.
Just to add on quickly, in terms of like the structuring of our questions with that, we usually, as Kata mentioned, if we don't understand the topic, then our listeners aren't going to understand it. And so I think it's important to start off more broadly and ask, what's the project about? What are the important aspects? What's kind of the overall aspects of the project, to then be able to go more in specific detail, but making sure you're starting broad and then zooming in, so that way when you get to the part where you're zooming in and you're looking at very specific points, you understand like the general aspects of it in terms of structuring questions.
I have a question. So one of the things that we, COVID hit over 2 years ago now, and one of the things that the podcast team was supposed to be able to do was to be able to go out into the field and reach people in their place where they were. And of course, due to COVID, everything has been online, and nobody's really been together to do an interview in person. And so there's that huge world of learning of technology and those sorts of things. But what can people really do with a podcast, and not just in studio, but in the field? Or what are some other ways they can take these audio storytelling and podcasting and either go to someone, or what are other ways that people can use podcasting or do podcasting that maybe you haven't touched on or spoken about yet?
I could touch on that quickly. I think my favorite thing about podcasting, looking at different from written word, is that instead of having to gather information from a source or gather information from someone and write out a quote or paraphrase, you get to hear their voice themselves, and you get to hear their experience and their own stories and their own knowledge. And I always say that podcasting is the best media because you hear them talking about it versus you talking about it in your own language and your own voice when you're writing it in an article. And I think that being able to go out onto the field and being able to capture their voice and their experiences in their home, it's going to make it a lot more genuine, and it's going to make the experience a lot more real, not only for your guests, but for yourselves and for the people listening.
Thank you. So students, what has been your best or most favorite, maybe or most educational part of working on a podcast? You're all journalism students, so this is a different type of journalism product from what you work on. So if you could each take a moment to share some of that would be great.
I think my favorite part is just learning the most like random information from our sources. Like, I think I listened to one of the podcasts, and I think they said something along the lines of like, when they go hunting, they clean the site after they've hunted the animal, something like that. So animals will not stop going there, and like they will keep going on to the same location. And so I thought that was really interesting. So I think be part of this podcast is that you're constantly learning, because your job is to translate research. So we get to absorb that research and learn as we go on with it. I would say that is my favorite part of the podcast.
Yeah, I'll quickly say something. In terms of like the most educational part of working on the podcast, I think I've just gotten a better handle and understanding of audio editing software, Adobe products, like just at a very basic level. It feels like I've gotten a much better handle on that. I can do the work much faster than I used to, looking backpedaling to like first year journalism, that was a slow process for me working on audio and video software and editing my work. But now it's super interesting, but I just think I like having that extra experience outside of school and having more time spent on the editing and producing side of that just has given me a better, just made me a lot better at moving quickly and doing a better job of editing. So yeah, that's I'd say that's probably like been the most educational thing for me. Of course, I would echo everything that Catalina said as well, in terms of just becoming more knowledgeable and learning lots from interesting conversations and people. But if I'm looking at it at a purely like mechanical journalism viewpoint, I would say definitely the audio and engineering editing software bits I've gotten a better handle of.
I'd love to echo what Kata and Ethan said, just in terms of our guests. I think that's my favorite part. And that really ties along with the remote aspect of podcasting specifically here. I would have never been able to meet guests in the Yukon or from across the world if it hadn't been what I feel like from remote podcasting softwares and from remote podcasting in general. I've met so many guests from different areas and different perspectives. And while it's amazing to go to Banff for the day and do that, I think that's part of it. I also don't always get to interview, like I mentioned, people from across the world or people from the Yukon or anyone there. And I think that has been my favorite part, is being able to meet so many different people in so many different places.
You've touched on a few really good points there. So what would it take for other organizations or other individuals to do this type of knowledge mobilization? We had a question about time, but what about cost or equipment? Nowadays everybody's got an iPhone or a mobile phone, and you've got access to cameras and so on accessible. But what would it take for them to do this? Can you do it on a smaller budget? Do you have to have lots of money? Do you have to have fancy software? You talked about Adobe, but what could it look like? Is there a range of possibilities, or is it quite sort of a structured setup that you need?
I can jump in on this one a little bit, being the PI and sort of looking at it a bit more from an individual academic perspective. I'm not sure who's all here, but the one thing with the Canadian Mountain podcast is that because we're looking at an organization that is a network, we're trying to figure out how to reflect the research of many groups, and we're normally interviewing them when they're a little closer to the end of their process and they have something to share. But if you're a researcher yourself, you don't have to necessarily, you think of conference papers and you think, well, I wait till I have my findings and then I podcast it or then I share it. And what I actually think would be the most interesting way to consider podcasting as a researcher is to use it as a way to share your process. Think of yourself as that hero, the main character, and explain your process and what you learn and what goes right or what doesn't go right as you go through a project. Now, obviously, if you require any ethics or approvals, you need to imagine this earlier on to be able to use the work and record, especially if you're using, say, pieces from information, if you're doing qualitative research. But I think it could be a really interesting way to document a project. And if it's something that you're just chatting with a couple of people on, the technology doesn't have to be too complicated. You know, we record on Squadcast, which is $20 a month with, you know, little headphones kind of thing to record, but you could also use you know, USB microphones that cost about under 150, or you could even probably record into your iPhone too, and then like, you know, edit it down if it's relatively simple audio. So I don't think that, you know, the format that we're doing here is the only option for academics who are looking to podcast. And I think the idea of actually planning it into your research gathering and your sharing and dissemination being throughout the project and not really just at the end could be an interesting way to try out podcasting in a limited time frame and see how it works for you.
Thanks, Meg. Does anyone have anything to add to that one? No? Okay. Well, we have one more question here. One of our audiences noticed that no one is presenting has their pronouns listed, and that usually comes, it's usually seen when listing pronouns comes to students. Oh, I'm sorry. I usually see that when it comes to students in media, is listing pronouns detrimental to viewers due to seeming to give a political lean? Should people not be doing that? I'm really not familiar with pronouns, and EDIJ is something that I definitely know personally. I have a knowledge gap in that understanding myself. But I think that's a really good question to ask, and I'm definitely not well educated on that, to be honest. Does anybody have any other insight to offer?
Well, Gabby just mentioned in the chat that she goes, I think when we joined the panel, it didn't give the option. Many of us are logging in with our Mount Royal accounts, which we are new to us. So I don't think there was a time to configure it. So often I would say that many of my students that I do see in chats and options have that clarification there, but it might have just been the technical elements of today where it wasn't evident in a way to include it.
Thanks for asking.
Yeah, I guess I would just say I don't think it's detrimental. Like you ask, Victoria asked if listing pronouns is detrimental to viewers. I would not say it is detrimental at all. Like I don't think that like, yeah, like Meg and Gabby said, we just didn't get the option to do it because of technical stuff. But I think it would happen normally. So I wouldn't worry. I wouldn't say that is something that would like affect viewership or anything like that.
And not to go too off topic, just as a comment, I do fully understand that the pronouns is an act of inclusion, and actively doing that is showing inclusion in our media, which is something that we always strive to go. But I think it was more just a technical aspect.
Yeah, we worked through quite a few technical issues beforehand. So, okay. Well, I think we're going to wrap it up now. We've got a few extra minutes to spare so we can release everybody back to their workday early. So I just want to thank everybody for joining us today. This session has been recorded, and so we'll be releasing that recording as well. So for those registered who couldn't log in time, we'll be sharing this out. So thanks again to